Good evening, everyone. Well, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate to see such a huge crowd. I can't see all of you, your faces, but and thank you, Cody and Eugene, for this kind invite. When I got an invitation, I was trying to figure out, I was struggling really, how am I going to talk about and what I'm going to talk about. And I asked him, well, who's going to be my audience? And he said, these are mainly developers who are trying to figure out what kind of tools people actually use in the midst of this storm that it actually has gripped us. And I thought, well, it would be fitting to sort of cast this talk as a survey of how AI has actually changed software engineering today. Inevitably, it's actually changed how we're going to be doing the landscape of software engineering, how we're going to thrive on it. And I thought it would be fitting for me to sort of explore that and then talk about how we in engineering at Databricks actually using some of these particular tools. So this is going to be slightly different from my previous talk, but I think it was fitting for me to sort of explore that. And so since this is an AI talk, I asked Claude, who am I? Right, and he says, get lost, you don't have any money. Right, give me some money before I actually tell you who am I. And so I went to ChatGPT to find out who am I, and it actually gave me a nice little description with emojis saying, you know, you are a member of a technical developer staff at Databricks, you are a contributor to Apache Spark and MLflow, you're author of a particular book, and you worked at Databricks for the last 7 years, and you worked with all these other different companies. So I thought that was actually nice. So I thought it was actually fitting to get that from the external agent to tell me who am I. And so a little bit about myself, but I just want to get an idea of who you guys are, right? So how many of you actually have used Copilot and GitHub and are still using it? All hands are done. Okay. How many of you are using Jules? Not me, but Jules that was just recently released by Gemini. I mean, by the Google guys. Anybody heard about Jules? Right. It's a new tool that's actually sort of late in the game to say this is their coding agent, and I tried it. And I wasn't quite impressed with it as much. But obviously, everybody actually wants money, so I wasn't going to dish out my credit card. Claude Code, anybody using Claude Code here? Okay. Anybody wants to share what the experience has been with Claude Code? How about you? You want to tell me?
Yeah, I love it.
You love it? Right.
To a point where it's just
Absolutely. It's a Claude, I mean, it's terminal-based, there's no GUI, and it kind of reminds you of early days of Unix. Right, you're actually dealing with the operating system. You're typing all these particular commands. It's quite actually powerful. And obviously, if you're using these particular tools, you're going to be using all these LLMs which are associated with these coding agents. Cursor, anybody using Cursor? Okay. Anybody want to volunteer what your experience has been with Cursor compared to Copilot? Okay, yeah, you do like the agentic flow and the traditional UI interface along with the chat GPT that actually the chat interface that. Okay. So you're wipe coding every day. Okay. Open Codex, they just came out recently. Anybody dishing out $20 a month for that? It's actually a good tool from OpenAI. And then MCP, I heard the name MCP today. There's a little bit of talk this evening about MCP. Anybody using MCP or configured that with their tools, okay? Anybody has written an MCP agent? Okay, brilliant. So I've got an idea of who you guys are. So this is my talk today, really. This is my TLDR. This is what I'm going to talk about. At a high level, and then we'll get into some more details. AI is changing, that's undisputable. It's changing the way we're actually changing things. It's going to change the way we're going to write being code in the next 5 or 10 years. But the important bit about that is going to be a very collaborative effort. We're going to be interacting with the AI in the language you're most familiar with, your natural language, right? So that's the thing that we're actually moving forward. But we are early. We are early in the game, very much early in the game. And things are changing at an incredible velocity that we have never seen that before. And for us to adopt and thrive, we have to be on top of the things. And we are the ones who are actually going to shape and shepherd the future of software engineering to come. It's not dead, it's thriving. It's a new way of looking at things. Now, I think it's interesting to begin this particular talk by, anybody heard of Andre Karpathy? Okay. While he was at OpenAI, or while he was at Tesla and then went to OpenAI, he gave a talk about 2 or 3 years ago at the time when deep learning had really taken off. and it was like the thing to do. He gave a talk that actually went viral called Software is Changing, right? And then just 2 weeks ago, he gave another talk at Y Combinator, which he said software is changing again, right? And he said software hasn't changed in the last 70 years as much as it has changed fundamentally and foundationally in the last 3 or 4 years, right? And he considers this enormous paradigm shift as software 3.x. And that's a completely new way of doing things, right? Because now the new way of doing things is that we're going to be interacting, as I said earlier in my TAR, using the natural language. And so just to get an idea of what he actually means by the evolution of software, the way it's actually emerged over the last 20 or 30 years or 70 years, if you look at software 1.0, right, we wrote the code, whether it was machine code, whether it was assembly code, we wrote the code that programmed the computer. We were in the driving seat. We dictated what the behavior of the particular program was going to be, right? That was software 1.0 conceptually, right? We were writing the program that actually programmed the code. Fast forward to the 20s, software 2.0 came into the light, which was a deep learning. So we actually saw the first emergence of deep intelligence through the neural networks. And there, the way we programmed the neural networks was that we gave them the initial random weights, and we gave them some training data, and we had an optimized function that it would actually work over, and through back propagation and all that, it actually calculated new parameters and gave us a program, gave us a neural network. And that became the first AlexNet that was able to identify images and categorize things based on looking at images and sentences. Fast forward another few years, just within that short period, we now entered what he calls software 3.0. And in software 3.0, the prompts, the English language that we communicate with are the ones that are going to program. And now the LLMs to transformer have become the programmable languages or the programmable computer that we actually detect, that we actually behave. And this is what he talks about, that the paradigm shift is the software 3.0. And to give you a more specific example, if you actually look at how it actually translates to code, in 1.0, if you actually had to write a sentiment analysis, what do? You write a little Python script with a bag of embedded words, and you feed some positive words and the negative words, and you parse through the sentence, and you allocate a particular label, whether this is going to be good or bad, right? In 2.0, you actually give some training example, positive sentiments, negative sentiments. You give a classifier to train on, and eventually get some parameters that will take some untrained data and classify you to be whether positive or negative. In 3.0, we don't even write any code, right? This same classifier can actually be run by using a few short prompts, and now you actually have an image classifier. So that's what he's talking about in terms of how LLMs now are actually programmable things. And more concretely, what he's talking about is the red box that I'm talking about over here. So if you see the shift and you see the velocity at which how things change since November 2022 to where we are today, where all these LLMs are getting better, faster, stronger. They have reasoning thought now. They have the ability to do reason by thought. They have the ability to analyze. They have the ability to calculate workflows. And they've given these other agents, which now can be actually written using this particular functionality, to be able to be of assistance. And this is the 3.x that we're actually talking about today, that all of you are going to be using that as part of your daily work. You're here today because you are actually in this particular realm. You are doing this today, and you'll continue to do that for the next decade or so. And Andre Karpathy's takeaway was that software engineering is changing. There's no denying, right? It has changed for the last year. This one is the biggest seismic shift we've actually seen. And the workflows, the way we're going to be working day to day, our modus operandi is going to completely change. But the important bit is that with this massive shift comes the uncertainty and the opportunity that we actually have, right? So we have the opportunity to either take it, shape it, shepherd it, and define how we actually going to be working, how other developers are going to be working. So this is what we're talking about in terms of the shift. And it gets really interesting when you hear statements like this, right? When you hear Microsoft CEO at the recent Build conference saying 30% of all its code is written by AI. Now, if you think about it, right, Microsoft is a huge company. It's been here for ages. they've written millions and millions of lines of code. 30% of the code, he claims that it's written by AI. That's a bullish statement, right? I'm not doubting, but I'm saying this is bold. And obviously he would say that because he's part of the company that's pushing the AI to the frontier. If you look at the statement recently made by the CEO of Anthropic, he said that all code will be AI generated within a year. That's very bold, and I'll get into a little bit more about what he actually means by that when we talk about Anthropic. And then finally, the chief scientist at Google, Jeff Dean, who predicted that within a year, the AI will actually be like a junior developer. And when he meant by junior developer, he wasn't trying to denigrate or put down junior developer, but the AI junior developer is going to be your assistant who's going to be writing the code. And I kind of believe in that. And I kind of say, yeah, this kind of actually makes sense. That's really the ground reality today. And we're actually entering that particular phase where we are using agentic AI as our companion, that we are shepherding it, we are guiding it, we're instructing to do things. And when you hear bullish statements like that, you don't stop to wonder, what is my role as a software developer in this massively changing environment, right? Am I going to be working myself into oblivion, or am I going to be part of it? And I think my contention is that in the next 5 or 10 years, we are going to be the ones who are going to be working along with the agentic AI to really shepherd the future where we're actually heading. Now, in order to test this hypothesis about where we're actually heading, this particular guy calls himself pragmatic engineer, Gargley Ors, and he actually gave a very fascinating talk just a couple of weeks ago in London, where he took a survey of all the developers, or some of the developers, well-known developers across the industry, among these industries, which are startups that build these particular tools, like the agentic AI, the Cursor, and the frontier models, the big tech companies, the AI startups, and the individual software. I'm not going to entertain about all the other stuff. I'm just going to talk about the AI startup companies and the individual developers that we are interested in to find out what they have to say and how it's actually changing that. But take the QR code. It's actually a good talk to talk about. And his TLDR was that the AI startups, which are creating these foundational models, which are creating all these tools for us to actually use at agentic AI, have the highest rate of adoption, and they experiment it rapidly because the field is changing and they have to keep up with, and they have to encourage developers like us to actually use that. The big tech companies are a bit more cautious. They're looking at the infrastructure, they're identifying what are some of the small things that we can actually automate, and based on that, they're actually sort of adopting it very slowly and very gradually. But they want to make sure they do it right, so that when they deploy these things at a scale, it just doesn't fall flat on their face. But the important thing to me was the sentiment of this growing enthusiasm of developers who are people like us, who have the enthusiasm, who have the creativity, and who have the chutzpah to actually work on these things. And I think it's interesting to talk about that. So he talked to a few people in Anthropic, and one of the guy, Boris Cherny, who is the creator of Claude, this is what he said about the $3. He said, we are only scratching the surface today. The model is moving very fast and at the exponential rate, and we can actually solve that in the little red box, that we are actually moving at a very quickly pace, and we have never seen the velocity at which things are actually changing. And the other things that actually came out from this particular survey at the Anthropic developers is that when we gave Claude to our engineers, the interest was phenomenal. They just accepted it right away, and they started playing around, and we actually began to see how they're actually using it. And it was quite interesting to observe, how quickly they adopted it. And one of the claims, again, is 90% of the code written in Claude is written by Cloud Code. Now, I thought about that, and it sort of reminded, I'm going to date myself by saying this. I remember the early days when I was at Sun Microsystems, we had this thing called VM Linux, or VM Unix. And it was an operating system kernel that was written in assembly that would actually bootstrap itself into the network and then start downloading all the different components they actually need to build the entire operating system. So it was like self-bootstrapping. And this kind of reminds me of that. Or in the early days when we were writing compilers, we would write the core compiler in the assembly language, which then bootstrap other components like the lexical analyzer and the linter and all that, which then compiles your code. It's called self-bootstrapping. And so Claude is kind of doing that pretty much thing, writing code to write itself. It's amazing. And so their usage is that we found when we released Claude, 40% on the day was a huge spike. And thereafter, we have seen a huge amount of interest in adoption of Claude. And now, at Anthropic, we have made onboarding of the new hires a mandatory thing to use Claude. And they were really surprised that the amount of time it took them to come on board to understand the code base, because there's a large code base. Claude actually brought that particular onboarding process from 2 weeks to just a few days. So that has been the train in Anthropic. And one of the things that actually has drawn people to the Anthropic developers is the release of the open source model called MCP. And when MCP was released, it allowed the LLMs extension to all these external tools that you could actually use to build a more correct response by using these particular tools and getting the data and orchestrating that, and the agent would actually be able to actually use this to give you the response to a particular query. And you heard about earlier from my talk how the agent workflows forth. And what really has enabled is this particular MCP protocol, which has become a standard. And since its release, all these other big companies have made this support available in their LLM frontiers or in the agents or in the coding agents, whereby you can very easily plop in an MCP external server that is just a matter of taking a JSON file and saying, okay, this is where the MCP server is, this is what it actually does, here are all the tools that you can actually use, and boom, you can run with it. And that has really sort of become the darling of agents to be able to integrate very easily with the MCP. And I've got some QR codes over here. It's sort of become like the marketplace of MCP agents. There are hundreds of thousands of agents within a few months that have come out, right? It's become like the Kaggle data set of MCP agents all over the place, right? And so now let's just shift a little bit and talk about how seasoned developers are actually looking at this particular thing. And you talk to one guy called Armin Ronacher. I don't know if you actually have heard about him, but he's the creator of Flask and Jinja and founder at Sentry. And the engineer or the interviewer asked him, how are you actually using the agentic AI? How are you actually using Gen AI? How are you using all these particular tools? And he, at the moment, after 6 or 7 months using it, wrote this particular blog as a reflection. He said, 6 months ago, if you asked me about using Claude, if you asked me about using any of the agentic tools, I wouldn't use it because I don't trust it. I don't like black box. But after playing around with it, he came around and said, you know, today I've accepted the fact that AI is actually changing everything. And the way I do work, and the way I write code, and the way I instruct my coding agent, the way I shepherd it has made a huge difference. And this was a confession that he said, I currently don't sleep a lot. Right? Before I used to sleep a lot, but I don't. And Claude has become now the catnip from programmers. It feels like it, right? I use it every day because I'm so energized and I'm so confused at the same time that I'm willing to try new things. And I think people who are actually using this today see that. They're all developers who have come out from the cold and realize, oh my goodness, this is something new, right? This is really something that I've never seen it before, that really talks to you, that really works with you, that creates the code, but you can actually shepherd it, and it's getting better and better because of the progress that you have made in the little red box I talk about, the 3.x, and it's keep on changing. It's keep on changing every day, right? And he confessed. He said, you know, Claude has got shockingly good, and it's got nothing to do with Anthropic. This is not an endorsement for him. They didn't pay him. He is just saying because this is how he actually feels very strongly about it when he's actually writing code. And he said before, when I started working with it, I realized that I've come over the hurdle. My initial skepticism was melted because of what it could do, because I could see it doing it. And I could say, no, stop it, let's go this way. And he would actually follow me. And I would tell, no, try this thing. And he would try that. And you can actually see it doing it. It's not like a black box that just spews things out, right? And one of the things that he realized that the hallucination bits of it that people are worried about is diminished or mitigated because it keeps on correcting itself, especially in the context of code generation. When you start asking it to write this test suite, If something doesn't work, he'll try to figure out how to actually change it. And that was sort of his confession. And another distinguished engineer, ThoughtWorks, has been looking at how to actually integrate and adopt LLM within their engineering company. Started sort of thinking about those things, and she was very methodical in penning and writing and reflecting all these in these very mini blogs that helps his leadership to say, this is how we actually do that. So if you look at the titles of this blog, for example, the role of a developer skills in the agentic coding, which was just written about a couple of months ago, where she talks about how these agents are actually changing the way we're actually doing things, the landscape. And she's very methodical and she's very articulate in the way she actually expresses that. And then finally, Simon Willison, who's the creator of Django, and he has been writing blogs for the last 23 years. And Karpathy, one of the renowned engineers in deep learning and AI today, say, this is a blog that you got to read, right? If you haven't read Simon's blog, you don't know what LLM is about. And if Simon talks about, if Andre Karpathy talks about it, there's something in his blog which is insightful that gives you the ability to say, okay, this is what he's talking about actually makes sense. And his confession is that the coding agents actually work, right? They're not fibbing things, they actually do work. They run LLM in a loop, they will run your compiler, they will run your linter, they will grab things, they will ask you things, you can actually see the way it actually works. And the model improvements in the last 6 months have changed dramatically that you can actually see they're getting better and better. And again, this is the 3.x box that I talked about in the red on a daily basis. And one of the things that Karpathy talks about, and I'm bringing Karpathy back in the conversation because I started with him, it's very important to have that context. He talks about this whole notion of partial autonomy, that you as a developer have the partial autonomy, the partial control in how you're actually gonna adjust and calibrate this particular cycle of generation and human verification. So he talks about that you actually have the control, whereby you can actually keep your agentic AI on a leash, so to speak, how much you actually want to give it the liberty to go ahead and generate your code, and how much you're going to verify it. And the faster you can actually go through this particular cycle of verification and generation, the more productive you're going to be, because now you actually are gaining the confidence of what is being produced is something that you can actually use with a bit of confidence. And this is sort of his advice to developers, saying that, using this particular meme, keep your agentic AI on a leash, and start with concrete tasks. Don't tell him to boil the bloody ocean, right? Start with concrete tasks. Start with approaches. What about if I try this? What about if I try that? Do you try this particular API? See actually works. Write this particular unit test. And once you're confident that it has actually gone through enough testing, and you can look at the code and say no changes and change that, you can verify and then do the commit. And the way he expresses that quite vividly in Cursor, and those of you actually are Cursor fans, he talks about the traditional interface on the left-hand side is your GUI that actually gives you the ability to look at the code. And we visually are much more adept at absorbing information because we got GPUs built in it that actually gives us the ability to look at things than looking at the terminal code. And the right-hand side is the agent which orchestrates everything. And the way he talks about the partial autonomy in autonomy of a cursor is the autonomy slider that you actually have control over. And he uses this metaphor from Tesla. How many of you drive Tesla? You don't admit it? All right. Those of you who drive Tesla have a console that actually gives you the ability to say how much you actually wanted to give the control, right? To actually do that. He uses the same analogy over here with Cursor. You can actually have the slider to see how much autonomy you actually want to give Cursor to go ahead and generate the code. And so coming from tab all the way to the command I that says, go ahead and rip it, right? And there's a lot of hype in 2025. This is going to be the year of the agents. But he contends that no, this is not going to be year of the agent. This is going to be the decade of the agents. It's going to take us a long time. And even Bill Gates, just a couple of days ago, gave an interview. He said, AI is not going to replace us for another 50 years, right? What it's going to do is help us to automate very tedious tasks. And how many of you actually are using Cursor or using coding agents that you look at the tedious task and you're confident with and you're ready to put it in production? How many of you are doing it? Okay. Still, we are early in the stage. It takes a little bit of effort to do that, because one thing you don't want to do is have it generate 10,000 lines of code, and then all of a sudden, SRE calls you midnight, everything is gone broken. So you have to do it on a very incremental basis, and you have to test and experiment. And now what I want to do is just talk about how we're actually using at Databricks engineering, all developers, in particular Apache Spark group, because that's the group I'm most familiar with and working with it. And what we realized a couple of years ago was that during the COVID, everybody actually went to Stack Overflow to find out about how you do something in Spark, right? How do I use this data frames? How do I use this API? How do I use this RDD? How do I use structured streaming and all those things? When ChatGPT was released, we saw a big dip. Nobody was actually going to Stack Overflow. We saw a big dip in our Apache Spark documentation, almost 50%. And we were trying to figure out what's going on, right? Why? Because everybody was using these particular tools. Right? They are using these particular tools. The thing about some of these tools is they've been training in old data, right? It is still. So your documentation might be 2004 because you just released a new release of that, and documentation is not out there. But what do you do then? Right? You have this particular gap. So we're kind of investigating how we can make sure that LLM gets most recent data, most recent documentation, most recent code example. And one of the tools available for you guys to explore is this thing called Git ingest. And what it does, it actually takes your GitHub and takes your code base and takes your documentation and creates empty markdown file and creates a text digest that the LLM can actually parse and make it more friendly compared to HTML, right? And so when you take this particular GitHub ingest and give that as a context to your cursor or to your Claude agent or to your codex that use this particular LLM text that I have for all my queries, you will get the most recent context to the LLM, and you'll probably get more answers. And you probably have heard, and the way we actually, at Databricks in engineering, everybody actually comes on board. This is our environment. We actually have a dev environment that engineers get cursor, Claude Goose, and thing to use, and then we have these MCP servers. And MCP servers are things like Confluence, things like Glean to skim your Slack messages, things like GitHub issues that you can actually find out about the PR. So these are some of the MCP servers which we actually use. The thing that we have to be careful about that you don't want to use too many MCP servers because you could clutter the context. And when you clutter the context, the agent and the LLM will get confused. So you want to make sure that when you are making a query within the cursor, within the Goose, and you configured your LLMs, you configured your Goose to use MCP server, use this particular context. So use Spark Docs, or use GTP this in order for you to answer this particular query. And it will tailor the context rather than going through each and every MCP server to query, can you actually answer this question? Do you actually have a tool to do that? So this is sort of one thing to keep in mind. And some of the experimentation that we're actually doing is very much like, things like, I have this particular file, can you explain me what it does? I just filed a particular PR, can you tell me what this PR is all about? Oh, this Jira has been assigned to me, I have no bloody clue what to do with it. Can you explain how to start this thing? And it will actually guide you. And these are the experimentation that I think is the way very slowly to make that part of your daily edit, compile, debug, commit, part of the CIA engine. And this is how we're actually using it. Now, all engineering teams within Databricks are using different ways, but they all have access to the same kind of environment. And I use it very, very vividly because I write a lot of documentation, I write a lot of code examples, and I make sure that the latest and the greatest documentation is available for me to actually write that. And you heard the refrain very common is that in marketing or in websites you're building, content is the king, right? But within the LLM realm, context is the king. If you provided the wrong context, you're going to get wrong answer. So here I tested. I said, I'm not going to give you access or context to any of the assets. You are an Apache Spark expert. Write this particular new API data source that I want to give you. And it generated the code. But it's fucking fib. None of it is true. Right? It just made up this code for no reason. And none of it actually is relevant to what I asked it to do. Why? Because it didn't have the context. It just made things up, right? But if you actually provide the context, when I gave it the particular context to say, go ahead and talk to the, go ahead and talk to use this particular context and go ahead and now do the API and build this particular data source that you reads the news API, it actually went and did it, right? It actually looked at the particular documentation, it found it. It looked at the base class, it found it. It went to the GitHub, it found the particular source. It said, okay, I have to derive this particular code using this. As you can see, actually, there is a way it actually did that. And so context is actually makes a difference. And the same thing when I used that with the Goose, I'm not going to go through it because I'm out of time. It actually did pretty much the same thing. And you have to make sure that you actually give the particular context. And so, just to do my takeaways, as I said, AI is changing the way we're actually doing things. We are going to be doing in collaboration, and I showed how people actually work in collaboration. You heard from the developers how they're actually using that. And most likely, you're probably using it in the same way, where you actually are going to be interacting with it, you're going to be testing it, you're going to be trying it. But we're quite early in its stage. Things are changing on a daily basis. Every day something new is coming out, and we just have to be adapted, and we just have to do that in order to thrive. And we can actually shape and shepherd what the landscape of software engineering is going to be. And so here is my emoji version of the TLDR, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Jules. All right, we have time for one question.
Okay, I'll take one question. I'm going to be around if you guys want to ask me anything.
Questions?
This guy right in front of you.
I missed
Right
it.
here.
Where's the Databricks promotion?
I think I didn't have it. I didn't know we actually had to have a product. But yeah, if you want to talk about Databricks, go ahead. Yeah, it's a great company. We do a lot of work in AI. So I didn't have a product pitch for me. I'm part of the developer advocacy team working in engineering, and I wanted to share how we're actually using that because I felt that most of you are in the same boat in terms of using agentic AI and where are the things you did. But if you want to have specific questions about Databricks, just get me on the side and I do that. Maybe next time I'll come up with a product pitch. All right, thank you guys.
All right,
Cheers.
excellent. Yeah, let's hear it all. Hear it for Jules. Thank you, Jules.